Hi, my name is RC Story, and it's story time for adults. Allow me to hypnotize you with gnosis, knowledge that will put you to sleep and wake you up. Whether you're taking a nap, going to bed, hiking, doing yoga, or just relaxing, allow the knowledge to calm your soul, whether you're awake or falling asleep. This channel is for entertainment purposes only. Hypnosis audio recorded books are typically not found in stores, on library shelves, or easily accessible. The best kept secrets are usually in books, because who has time to read? So let me read for you. It's up to the listener's discretion to harvest the truth and weed out the distortion. The views in the books do not necessarily reflect the host or channel's views, but are for entertainment and relaxation only. Now, take a deep breath. Inhale. Exhale. And enjoy your story time. Did you ever sit down for an evening at a card table with a 1,000-piece puzzle? By yourself? It takes hours and hours to put it together, doesn't it? With trial and error and patience all playing their parts. We're still trying out some of the as yet unfitted pieces in our worldwide puzzle, and we've been at the table since 1949. However, even though incomplete, it shows us a graphic representation of the Earth's picture 11,500 years ago. Look at a globe of the world. Pick out longitude 90 degrees west, latitude 60 degrees north. This point is in the western part of the Hudson Bay. Now, hold the globe so that 90 degrees west, 60 degrees north is at the North Pole on the axis of rotation. This was the configuration of the world between 18,500 years ago and 11,500 years ago. The North Polar ice cap formed the Laurentian Basin in Canada. The continents, however, were not quite the same. There was a huge continent in the Atlantic Ocean area, which stretched from Iceland and England across the Atlantic to the Bahamas. The Gulf of Mexico and the Caribbean Sea did not exist. They were land at that time. There was another continent in the Pacific, covering an area now ringed by the Hawaiian Islands, the Galapagos, Easter Island, Tahiti, the Solomons, and the Caroline Islands. The province of Ceylon held the major civilization of India. Egypt and the Holy Land were thriving mixed Hellenes, was the home of a tall, blue-eyed blonde race, with standards of science and law unmatched to this day. The Amazon basin was an inland sea. Legends call it the Sea of Zerais, and the mouth of the Amazon River was then a wide seagoing connection between the Atlantic and Zerais. The western coast of South America was not mountainous. The prehistoric city of Tiahuanaco, Peru, now at 12,500 feet above the Pacific, was then at sea level. It was a metropolis seaport with a canal system for seagoing ships, as large as any we have today, traversing from the Pacific to the inland sea. Astronomers of Tiahuanaco used telescopes like ours of today, and they had a huge satellite orbiting the Earth west to east, 449 times per year, which they used as a time standard. Its orbit was so accurate. Ayodhya, now a suburb of Lucknow, was the capital of India, and the great navigators, the great scientists, the great explorers of the Eastern Hemisphere were the dark-eyed, dark-haired Mayans. About 11,500 years ago, and 9,550 BC, as dated by astronomers from Potsdam Observatory, from writings in the ruins of Tiahuanaco, the 60-mile thick shell of the Earth shifted its position once more, and 1/4 to 1/2 a day, 7,000 years after the previous shift. The North Pole moved southward, and the Sudan Basin in Africa shifted to the North Pole. This was the time which the Talmud states was the setting of the Pleiades below the horizon, when the Holy Land was moved into a region of terrible cold for many generations, actually for 5,000 years, until Noah's flood 6,500 years ago. The equatorial pivot points were off the coast of mid-Chile and in mid-China, near the Yangtze north of Vietnam. The great continent in the Pacific disappeared almost completely, what is now Easter Island. Then, on the edge of the continent, dropped to remain on the Pacific Ocean floor for 5,000 years, to be heaved up again in the cataclysm causing Noah's flood. What remained of the vast Pacific continent rolled to the South Pole, to be discovered by Mayan explorers as the last remains of their motherland, a frozen reservoir of mud at the bottom of the earth, millions of square miles in area. Of the great continent in the Atlantic, only a large island was left in the west, while the ocean between there and Gibraltar to the east was left shallow, muddy, and impassable to ships. A thread of a clue concerning the great knowledge of that time came out when Captain Cook discovered the Polynesian Maori tribe in New Zealand in the 1700s. They told him of ancient legends of Saturn's rings, and they hadn't heard even of telescopes. Now you try to see those rings with your naked eyes, and you'll find out that it's impossible. The evidence in Tiwanaku shows that their great civilization was wiped out so suddenly that people were caught in the middle of their normal daytime activities by catastrophic inundation. Further, evidence shows that this fabulous city suffered the same fate as Easter Island. Although the Rockies and Andes were started in this cataclysm, Tiwanaku was buried under the Pacific to remain there for 5,000 years, then to be heaved up to its present altitude of 12,500 feet in the last cataclysm 6,500 years ago. So the cataclysm of 11,500 years ago saw the Hudson Bay and the opposite polar area just southwest of Australia both rolled to the equator on opposite sides of the Earth, and the Sudan Basin region rolled to the North Pole to remain there for the next 5,000 years. While this shift was occurring, taking only 1/4 to 1/2 a day to complete itself, the Earth's oceans and atmosphere, through angular momentum, kept rotating in their normal direction during most of the shift, with the oceans violently inundating most of the lands of the Earth, and the atmosphere bringing unimaginable hurricanes of up to supersonic wind velocities. Whole continents were subjected to tremendous upheavals and earthquakes. The molten layer below the Earth's 60-mile thick shell broke through the shell in places all over the world, and was thereafter called Earth Fire by the pitiful few who survived. The oceans and winds took 6 days after the start of the cataclysm to resolve their holocaustic wars on the surface of the Earth, and on the 7th day began to settle down to 5,000 years of normal complacency. The 2-mile thick ice caps of the Laurentian Basin and the Indian Ocean, having shifted from their polar homes and started a new course of revolving equatorially, proceeded to melt at tremendous speeds in the torrid heat, carving great grooves in the mountains, as the rushing, gushing, swirling water and ice overwhelmed everything in their paths. The great amounts of moisture being poured into the atmosphere were to shroud the torrid zone in a dark fog for many years during several generations. The oceans rose some 200 feet all over the world with the sudden melting of the ice caps, as they do after each cataclysm. The end of the Laurentian Ice Age and the start of the Old Stone Age was complete. The Mayan tongue lived on in scattered remnants. Polynesian tongues, Greek, Yakut, Egyptian, Eskimo tongues, nomadic, Oriental, German, American Indian, just about all languages. The resurrection from the waters, Tao, lived on in many stories of a man who survived, later to become Ta-Aurora, Tangaroa, Taroa, depending on which tribe's legend you find. Adam and Eve could have sprung from the same story. Who knows? Genesis, 4,500,000,000 years ago. This regenesis, 11,500 years ago. Both in the Bible. a translation interpretation of Genesis 1, 2, and 3 from a reconstruction of what the Naga must have been to give us the chapters as we have had them in English, then retranslating directly from Naga to English, bypassing Greek and Hebrew. The Book of Genesis, chapter 1, 2, and 3. 1. In the beginning, 4.5 billion years ago, the universe was created in God's great design. Included was our sun and our planet Earth. And during one of the many cataclysms that occurred during the Earth's history, this one being 11,500 years ago, the Earth lands were all inundated with raging waters and ravaged by horrendous winds, and the oceans were all dark with muddiness, and the ill wind thundered over the troubled waters also. And as the storms abated, sunlight came back to the face of the earth as God intended. And while the Holocaust was abating, once more darkness and sunlight were re-established and distinguishable, and it was good. And sunlight was again daytime, and darkness again nighttime, in accordance with God's design, and evening and morning made one day. Again, God's original design was that there be a sky between the clouds and oceans, and in accordance with God's design, the heavens were re-established in that the sky again stood between the clouds and the oceans as the onslaught of the great storms abated. And God's heavens were indeed re-established, and that evening and morning were the beginning of the second day. And God's design was that the lands would not be entirely covered by the oceans as they were immediately following a cataclysm. So the disrupted oceans, now settling, drained off the higher lands. And in accordance with God's design, the dry land was earth, and the waters oceans, and once again it was re-established and good, as God intended. And since God's design was that the earth should bring forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit yielding fruit containing its seed, and the earth was again re-established. Therefore the earth being re-established brought forth grass and herbs, yielding their seed, and the fruit tree yielding fruit containing its seed, and it was good, as God intended. And the evening and the morning were the start of the third day. In accordance with God's design, there were normally lights in the heavens, which served to indicate months and seasons and days and years. Also, they served to furnish light on the earth as God intended. And as the great fog lifted and the clouds broke, the sun and moon reappeared, and also the stars. And once again, as God intended, they shone from the heavens, and the sun and moon again were able to divide light and darkness, which was good. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fourth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature living and bird flying should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were great whales and every living creature of the sea, and every kind of winged fowl, and it was as God intended and good. They were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and reproduce and replenish the oceans with sea life and the air with fowl. And the evening and the morning were the start of the fifth day. And it was God's will that some of every creature, cattle, and creeping thing, and beast of the earth should survive the cataclysmic inundation. Surviving then were the beast, the cattle, and everything that creeps on the earth. And it was as God intended and good. And in accordance with God's design, man, who was created in the image God intended, also was to survive, and have dominion over the fowl of the air, and over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. So it was God's design that man, who was created in the image God intended, both male and female, would survive the cataclysmic inundation. And they were blessed with God's original design to be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and control it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moves upon the earth. And God's design was that man, being given every herb-bearing seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree, and which is the fruit of a tree yielding seed, to man it should be for food. And to every beast of the earth, and to every fowl of the air, and to everything that creeps on the earth, wherein there is life, God's design was that green herbs shall serve for food, and it was as God intended. And everything which survived was as God had originally created, and still was in God's design and was good. And the evening and the morning were the beginning of the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were re-established, all the host of them. And on the seventh day, the recovery from the Holocaust and flood were complete. And the seventh day brought rest from the fight for survival against the Holocaust and its after effects. And the seventh day brought God's blessed peace as the Holocaust had abated, leaving those of his creation who survived. These are the same regenerations of the heavens and of the earth as they were re-established after the tumble previous to the one of this story, when the Lord God re-established the earth and the heavens. And every plant of the field before that cataclysm was in the earth, and every herb of the field before it grew. For the Lord God had not brought rain upon the earth in this region, and there was not a man to till the ground. But there was this cataclysm, and great inundations arose over the earth. And it was God's will that man should rise up from the earth, and keep the breath of life, and remain a living soul. This is his story. And it was God's will, after a cataclysm, that a continent eastward be established, and there in Eden lived the man of this story. And from this land grew other civilizations on other lands, with the motherland in the midst of all being the seat of wisdom, of all knowledge, both good and evil. And the inundation destroyed Eden and left only its 4 offspring lands. Note, the next 4 verses are probably incorrect, with the true description locked in correct translations of Egypt's Book of the Dead, and the missing portion of the Piri Reis map. The first land is near the river Pison, which includes the whole land of Havilah, where there is gold, and the gold of that land is good. There is bdellium and the onyx stone. And the second land is near the river Gihon, the same land which includes the whole land of Ethiopia. And the third land is near the river Hiddekel, that is the land toward the east of Assyria. And the fourth land is near the river Euphrates. And it was in God's province that the man was of Eden, where he lived and toiled. And he was descended from the original mankind, which settled that motherland. And God's design was that the man was warned, although the motherland was the source of all knowledge, both good and evil, if he stayed therein, surely he would die. And it was God's design that the man should not be alone, therefore a mate should be his. And since God had originally created every beast of the field and fowl of the air, and in his time Adam had named each one. And Adam gave names to all cattle, and to the fowl of the air, and to every beast of the field. But for Adam there was no mate, for Adam's mate had died after giving birth to a child of Adam. And the child of the man was a female, made in the image God intended. And Adam said, "This child is bone of my bone, and flesh of my flesh," and she grew into womanhood. Therefore the man was both father and mother to her, and she abode with him as they were one flesh. And the climate there was warm, requiring little or no clothing. Now at the time of the beginning of this story, the oceans were in their normal state of quietness, and it was known to the woman of this story that she was not descended from any of the peoples of the lands which sprang from the mother continent. And God's design was that the woman would learn that the people of the offspring lands would live on. But the people of the motherland from whom she had descended would surely all die. And she knew that in spite of the impending inundation, she would not surely die. For God's design was that from the day she was born, she was descended from the original mankind of the motherland, and was destined to know all, to discern both good and evil. And the woman, being of the motherland and being wise and good, knew that both she and her father were descended from the original mankind of the motherland, and they both were wise and had lived the good life, and it was that time of the year when some clothing was needed for warmth. And in the cool of those days, when they were wondering to which of the offspring lands they should go, and God's presence was felt strongly by them, Adam felt God's call and said, I have heard God's warning since the summer, and have feared, for I knew not where to find refuge. And God's warning had come to him in the summer, as a warning to leave the land of his ancestors. And the man said, The woman who is my daughter and descendant of my ancestors gave me this knowledge, and asked her, What gift of knowledge has God given you? And the woman said, I am of your ancestors and inherit their wisdom, and the coming inundations of the ocean has been made known to me. And God's design was that the oceans would so inundate the lands and drown all cattle and all beasts of the field and bury all dust. And God has thus given me victory over the oceans, such that the seed of future generations is in you and me, for the oceans will drown all others. And God's design was that although the inundation would greatly multiply her sorrows, she would even so bring forth children, as her love would be for her husband and his for her. And unto Adam it was God's will that he heed the words of his daughter, and God's warning that though they be descendants of original mankind of the motherland, they should leave it, as it was destined for destruction. And were they to stay, surely they would regret it. And where Adam was to go, the land would be difficult to farm, with thorns and thistles abounding, and even so the herb of the field was to be their food. By his toil and sweat, he was destined to fight the fight for survival after the inundation, even to the end of his days, when he would return to Mother Earth, as it was earth man came from, and unto earth he shall return. And after the inundation, Adam therefore made the woman his wife, and called her Eve, as she was to be the mother of all living from the motherland. And again, after the inundation, as they were in a colder climate, and it was God's design, as part of their survival, that they make coats of skins and be clothed. And it was God's design that Adam should take with him the knowledge of good and evil from the motherland, and he put forth and left in order to live. Therefore, in accordance with God's will, he left the Garden of Eden to survive and live from the soil where he was to go. So the man left, and the Garden of Eden was subjected to a cataclysm of earthquake and fire, and the motherland lost its foundations and sank beneath the oceans. Conclusion: India, Greece, Egypt. When Indra, king of the gods, had destroyed the Titan who held the waters of the earth captive in his entrails, he returned to the heights of the central mountain with the song of the rains and running waters in his ears. But where his dwelling once stood, he saw only ruins and ashes. So he summoned Visvakarman, god of works and arts, and asked him to build another palace to match his powers. The architect set to work. Soon towers, buildings, and gardens rose among lakes and woods. Each day he called for some fresh marvel, new delight for the eyes, walls more imperial, pavilions more richly adorned, statues greater in number and cunning. A fever seemed to burn in him, and Visvakarman, exhausted by his labors, decided to lay a complaint before the creator of the world. Brahma received him, gave ear, approved, and went to plead his cause before Vishnu, the Supreme Being. Help was promised. Soon a young Brahmin appeared at the king's palace and demanded audience. Charmed by the light of his eyes, Indra granted his request. "O king," said the messenger, "thy palace shall be the noblest of all." These words were sweet to Indra's ears, and he rejoiced. Vishnu's messenger continued, "It shall be the noblest of the palaces which the Indras before thyself sought to build." The king became uneasy. "Dost thou say that there were other Indras, other Visvakarmans before ourselves, other palaces before mine?" "Indeed, yes," the youth answered. "I have seen them. Moreover, I have seen the world arise and vanish again, like a tortoise's shell coming out of infinite ocean and sinking back. I was present at the dawn and the twilight of the cycles, past counting in their numbers, nor could I count all the Indras and Visvakarmans, even the Vishnus and Brahmas, following one another without end. O Salon, Salon, you Helaeans are but children. There is no old doctrine handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age, and I will tell you the reason behind this. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes, the greatest having been brought about by earth, fire, and inundation. Whatever happened, either in your country or ours, or in any other country of which we are informed, any action which is noble and great, or in any other way remarkable, which has taken place, all that has been inscribed long ago in our temple records, whereas you and other nations did not keep imperishable records, and then, after a period of time, the usual inundation visits, like a pestilence, and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and thus you have to begin over again as children, and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among ourselves. As for those genealogies of yours which you have related to us, they are no better than tales of children, for in the first place you remember one deluge only, whereas there were a number of them, and in the next place there dwelt in your land, which you do not know, the fairest and noblest race of men that ever lived, of which you are but a seed or remnant. And this was not known to you, because for many generations the survivors of that destruction made no records. Therefore will not we fear, though the earth be removed, and though the mountains be carried into the midst of the sea, though the waters thereof roar and be troubled, though the mountains shake with the swelling thereof. Psalm 46. The author. Mr. Thomas attended Dartmouth College and Columbia University, receiving his degree in electrical engineering from the latter in 1943. As a result of his research since 1949, Mr. Thomas has become recognized as the world's leading authority in the field of cataclysmic geology and its relationship to uniformitarian geology. In 1959, he applied his findings to the possibility of earthquake prediction, and at a seminar in November 1959, issued the results of his studies. He then accurately forecast the months, years, and locations of the major African and Chilean earthquakes of 1960, the Iranian earthquake of 1962, the Yugoslavian earthquake of 1963, and further predicted that California would have no major earthquakes for the following 5 years. His correlation research in the fields of stratigraphy, vertebrae, paleontology, radiology, oceanography, glaciology, seismology, paleophilology, earth magnetism, anthropology, and other related fields has demonstrated that the cataclysmic geology theories as presented by Deluc in 1779 and Cuvier in 1812 are definitely more acceptable than they have been previously within international scientific circles. Mr. Thomas's definitive efforts in integrating the various earth sciences have distinguished him as the only American today with such a specialized scientific forte. His research in paleosciences has led to new explanations of such enigmas as the Pyramid of Khufu at Gizeh, the ancient cities of Tiwanaku and Baalbek, and the giant statues of Easter Island. A little bit of knowledge can be a dangerous thing, or it can be a vibrant seed, giving rise to verdant forest and awakening sleeping giants. Please remember to hit the like button and do subscribe so that you won't miss any future uploads of knowledge and incredible audiobooks. And I'm your host, RC Story, and I appreciate your support.